Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I don't get out to British Columbia very often since I left working for the government here several years ago, but I've been here twice in the last 6 days. So it's been kind of an unusual week for me, but a wonderful opportunity to get back here. Thank you for the kind introduction. I am of Scottish ancestry, but I'm glad you left the bagpiper out of the picture this morning. So I want to talk to you today for maybe 25 minutes about the future of food in Canada from my perspective, based on a career to date in both government and industry, always in some way connected to the food industry. And I thought of really posing 5 tough questions and seeing if I could make a shot at answering those questions, looking out some distance into the future. But before I ask the tough questions, I want to ask an easy question. Which would you invest in? Greek yogurt or Greek bonds? Now this it may seem like a trivial question, but I think it starts from the perspective that if you're in the food industry, we have a lot to be grateful for, in the sense that we know people are always going to need to eat. In fact, we're facing a world population scenario that means demand for food is going to grow tremendously, and I'm going to talk about that. And as much as it's frustrating, and I'm going to talk about the tremendous difficulties we're having in terms of competitiveness in the food industry in Canada, I think we all agree we would much rather be investing in Greek yogurt than Greek bonds. So let's move from there and then ask, what are these tough questions? The first one, will there be a Canadian food manufacturing industry a generation from now? Well, I'm going to try to answer that in part. My first slide, I think, partly answers the question. Does the world need a Canadian food manufacturing industry a generation from now? Do we have a choice about what the Canadian food manufacturing industry will look like? What should that choice be, and who should make the choice? So let's start with the first question. Will there be a Canadian food manufacturing industry? Well, I think we know we have a certain amount of basic opportunity built on natural endowments. We have, as a country, the most fresh water per capita of any country in the world. We have the 3rd highest arable land measure per capita. We are a net food exporter. In fact, we're only one of 14 countries in the world, but in fact, if you really look at it, we're only one of about 6 that truly have a substantial capacity to be an ongoing net food exporter. There's not much to be concerned about in terms of our resource availability. When you compare that even to very large countries like China with enormous landmass, but with tremendous challenges with respect to water, with respect to land contamination, I think we all understand the opportunity that we sit on. So in terms of the water, well, there's the index. This is based on a UNESCO measure of water, fresh renewable water per capita. We're at 100, and you can see around the world there's no one else that actually comes close. The other factor that I think is very relevant is to appreciate that food entrepreneurialism is alive and well. Just here this morning I've heard some stories that makes it clear it's as alive and well in BC as anywhere. This is a short story here from last year. This was a contest that the City of Toronto has every year to identify the next great food product. And here is the winner with his artisanal cheese rolls. I think we all know that there is, in every city, in every community, there are literally thousands of budding food entrepreneurs that are coming up with a new idea. And with the diversity of Canadian population, the numbers of countries from which we all come, this is a tremendous asset to a country becoming more competitive and serving more and more markets with innovative food products. So yet another strength. But we do have a very important strategic choice. We have all these assets, but the question will be, in a world that is going to be challenged to feed the global population, are we going to sell our land, our water, and our genetic resources? Are we going to sell the commodities that are grown from those natural assets? Or are we going to sell, both in our domestic and in global markets, value-added food products? This is not obvious to me, and it's something we can talk further about. But then let's go on from that. I think we've answered the question. Yes, there will be a food industry in Canada. Its shape may not be clear. But the next question is, does the world need us? Does the world need Canada's food industry? Well, again, I think the answer is pretty clear. The FAO says in order to feed this larger, more urban and richer population, food production, net of food used for biofuels, must increase by 70%. This is based on global food or global population expectations that are rising very, very rapidly. I'm currently reading, not that I can say I'm a particular fan, but Al Gore has come out with his book called The Future. And he has laid out some very stark realities facing a number of issues in the global economy, environment, and when it comes to food, he paints a very stark picture of what we're going to face, not just with the fact that we have a larger global population to feed, but we're going to have a richer, a more wealthy middle-class population that's going to demand much more of their diet than they did when they were less well off. So we're facing 27 billion meals needed by 2050 based on current global population growth estimates. As I said, a changing eating habit situation where the population of cities will double. These cities will be increasingly populated by middle-class individuals who are looking for sources of animal protein in their diets, and the pressure to supply that will be relentless. No question, demand will exceed supply. And the big question, again, Mr. Gore will explain, that in a world of cheap energy and stable climate, this is perhaps doable with existing or with the new technologies that are increasing yields, with new measures to combat the issue of food waste, with better control of use of water. It is conceivable that you could feed a global population of 9 billion people. But what if energy is not cheap? And I think we all know energy is not going to get cheaper. And what if the climate becomes more unstable? Well, I think we know the climate is becoming more unstable. So these become major challenges. So the question becomes then for Canada, what are we going to choose? We know that the world needs us. What is the industry going to look like? Well, here is a graph showing the food plant closures in Ontario from 2005 to 2013. I don't know how this might mirror the situation in British Columbia. Is this the choice that we've decided to make? It's happening. In Ontario, in the last 7 years, we have lost nearly 60 plants, 60 food plants. Job losses now from those closures are approaching 9,000. Not that, frankly, the job loss issue is really the focus, but the fact is, while you won't see it in your pantry, a lot of these branded food products are the same as ever, but they're now being made in the United States. They're not being made in Canada. And this trend is relentless. It's, of course, very much driven by what's happened to our currency and a number of other factors. So, is this the choice we're making? Is it our choice now to let this happen? This is the current state of affairs when it comes to Canada's trade balance in processed foods. Since 2005, it has gone from a position of just about a negative $1 billion figure in processed food trade to a situation in 2011 where the deficit was $6.3 billion. That's the value-added food products that consumers are eating in Canada. But what's happening is effectively we're exporting about the same as ever, but we're importing a whole lot more. Is this our choice? There's the graph showing the growing gap between exports and imports in processed foods. Of course, the story on commodities is much different. We continue to track very well in growing our global exports of commodities, and of course, very strong grain prices have yielded tremendous returns to Canadian farmers. But where are the jobs? Where's the value added in that equation? So is that going to be our choice? The other fact is, now let's look at productivity. And this is really where the issue comes home for a company like Maple Leaf Foods. This may be a little bit hard to see, but what I'm showing you here is revenue per employee in food manufacturing Canada versus the United States 2008. This was based on a thorough study comparing Canada-US productivity in food manufacturing done 2 years ago by the George Morris Centre, the Institute on Competitiveness and Prosperity in Ontario, and several food and companies and government agencies. The gap is quite stark in everything from animal food manufacturing to bakery, to meat, to dairy, you name it. We've got a serious productivity shortfall. Not only is there a shortfall, but the rate of growth in US food manufacturing productivity is much better than it is in Canada. So again, this is based on tracking from 1990 to 2008. You see Canadian productivity in food manufacturing essentially flatlined, whereas the growth in the United States continues to increase. In fact, it rose quite sharply during the recession of 2008. And the value added in food manufacturing is higher in the United States than it is in Canada. This shows value added per employee in food and beverage manufacturing and all other manufacturing industries, and all other manufacturing, US versus Canada. And so here you have a line on the top there showing the United States as compared to Canada going back from 1983 up until 2007. So this picture is not getting any better based on what you see, at least up till the most recent period. So is that the choice that we're making? Well, let's look further. It's not just about productivity. What about labor? The labor shortfall in food manufacturing is becoming acute. I don't know about in your particular business, but in our business in Western Canada, in our plants, particularly in Alberta and Manitoba, we are facing a chronic structural shortage of labor. The HR Council, the Food Processing HR Council, estimates that between 2011 and 2014 that the industry will need to hire over 21,000 more employees. 13% of workers will be retired by 2015. And we know with the demographic trends, it's only going to get worse beyond 2015. This is why, frankly, the cases with respect to inspection and other aspects of government regulation. We've seen a diminished support for science, innovation, and statistical analysis. The recent cuts to Agriculture Canada have hit the research branch very hard. We've seen a real loss of investment in science in that department for several years now. It's not to say we haven't, in parallel, seen quite a boost in investment in science at the university level in this country, but I worry that we've lost a focus on public investment in agri-food science and innovation, and the cuts to Stats Canada and the statistical gathering that's relevant to the food and agriculture industries is quite significant. I mentioned the foreign worker program, the events of April, and these steps backwards, in my view, on a successful foreign worker program, and the immigration policies that would support lower skilled workers for our industry are very concerning. And of course, we continue to live with status quo when it comes to most issues in supply management and in food manufacturing. That is an ongoing significant problem. So the question then finally is, who should make this choice? Well, I do believe it's up to industry first and foremost. I've discussed some of the choices being made by Maple Leaf Foods. I believe that everyone, again, regardless of size, location, scale, subsector, we all need to risk more capital, on scale, technology, and people. We as industry need to close the productivity gap with the US. There's no choice about that. It's either do or die. The reason those 70 or 65 food plants have closed in Ontario is very much a story of failing to close the productivity gap with their US competitors. We need, as industry, to work with our value chain partners and listen to consumers like never before. The consumer landscape, as I'm sure you've been discussing, is changing so fast. And as much as we need to be competitive in our processes, if we're not in tune with the changing consumer attitudes and preferences, then the most efficient plant is still not much good. We need to act with more collective national purpose as leaders, not victims. Again, I fear sometimes in this industry or in this country, we have any number of axes to grind with government, But at the same time, we need to lead, we need to own our future when it comes to investments in science, in innovation, in skills, and of course in our plants and our products. But governments need to act as well. We need governments to engage with the industry, not just the agriculture departments, all departments, because departments like industry, like health, we know there's tremendous impacts from their policies and their choices that impact agri-food. We as Canada, I believe, do need to play hardball on trade. We are the world's, sure, I talked about it, big exporter, but we are the 6th largest agri-food importer in the world. And what's going on in terms of that growth in food imports seems to be occurring in many ways without due consideration to the gains that are being achieved by our competitors in our home market, while we in turn face things like mandatory country of origin labeling, any number of other restrictions impacting our exports to foreign markets. We need government to defend science and to promote healthy diets. We see so many negative things happening in that area. We need a lot more education of scientific reality, and government plays a role. And we need government to help us as stakeholders to sustain one conversation. Back to that point that if we let governments fragment the conversation, we become less effective as a national industry that's ready to confront the global challenge. So I'm ready to conclude. I asked 5 tough questions, and I would suggest the answers can be summarized as follows. Will there be a Canadian food manufacturing industry a generation from now? Yes, absolutely. But rising global demand does not guarantee rising market share or profitability. The industry will exist. Back to my point, we can either meet the challenge and produce more value-added foods, or we can sell our land and water, we can sell our commodities. We have a choice. Does the world need a Canadian food industry a generation from now? Yes, absolutely. Or we can concede our land, water, and genetic resources. Do we have a choice about what the Canadian food manufacturing industry will look like? Yes, we do. But being globally competitive is not a choice we can afford to postpone. What should our choice be for the Canadian food manufacturing industry? Well, I do believe it is to act urgently, to invest in scale, technology, and people to close the productivity gap. Big or small, we have to innovate and not necessarily invent. There's a difference. We need to innovate faster, especially in our manufacturing processes. And finally, who should make this choice? Well, I believe it is first and foremost industry, our shareholders, and the unfettered markets in which we want to operate. But government policy does matter, and we need a government policy framework that would define long-term strategic goals for the industry, not just the economic, but also the social and environmental reality of our industry. We need policy that corrects for market failures and facilitates consumer choice, and fundamentally policies that help grow the pie, wide and deep, not just focus on dividing that pie. So with apologies to Greece, I want to thank you. I hope no one here is of Greek origin, but if you are, it's always fun to see, in fact, that contrast. I love Greek yogurt, and of course it's just a phenomenal story of growing a market segment in a way that hardly anyone could anticipate. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a successful conference. Thank you. Well, China is a big challenge. In the pork business, we have the major problem that China is not following international standards when it comes to ractopamine. Ractopamine is a animal feeding additive that increases lean muscle development in hogs. It's approved around the world, but both China and Russia have put in place serious restrictions that in fact now prevent us from, in the case of China, direct shipments to China for pork. So it's, in our case, it's a big problem to access that market in pork. Of course, the big news is the purchase by Shineway of China of Smithfield Foods, which is, you know, to me, this is a profoundly interesting development in saying, where is the future? When I talked about, for example, that issue of who's going to own land and resources in food, well, it's happening. Like, there is very much a strategic food security decision being made by China in purchasing Smithfield, just as the Brazilians, JBS, bought a big chunk of the US beef industry. So it's no longer just about oil and, you know, resources we consider as finite. It's happening in terms of food resources and companies. So, you know, I think the challenge for China is food safety and animal health and all those issues. And the one commentary I've read about the Chinese purchase of Smithfield is that it's very much about the fact that China has now contaminated so much of its land and its water that its ability to grow food safely in its own environment is becoming really compromised. And they have this huge growth in demand for protein, but they're struggling to do that. So this is about China recognizing they need a cleaner manufacturing environment for food. So, you know, in our business in protein right now, we don't face a lot of direct competition in Canada from Chinese products. But the issues of food safety are the ones, and even when it comes to certain ingredients, there are some minor ingredients that come in from China into our supply chains that have been challenging to address because we've struggled to know exactly where they come from and whether they meet our standards of food safety. So anyway, that's kind of a rambling answer, but those are some of the issues.
Any other questions? Rick.
From your perspective, there's been a lot of conversation lately on the consumer side, the processing side, on the impact of labeling our food, both from a national perspective, but also the ingredients, the GMO. And I'm curious what your perspective on labeling of food is.
Big topic. Big topic. In fact, I was very frustrated last week because I attended the National Regulatory Forum of CFIA describing where they're going. They've had a senior executive trying to map out for the last 2 years a whole new labeling policy framework for Canada. And last week he announced that what he announced was a plan for 2 more years of consultation. I mean, it's very discouraging because we are faced with all kinds of expectations, but difficulties in finding a level playing field on labeling, finding the right way to meet consumer expectations for more information, but in a way that's not prejudicial, frankly, to the issues of science and nutrition that we're trying to convey. Man, big topic. I would say the biggest frustration I have right now is that government increasingly seems to want to back away from any responsibility for non-food safety and nutrition aspects of labeling. So methods of production, the definition of natural. But in my view, those are precisely the areas where we as industry are going to very much struggle to get on a level playing field. Those are the most controversial. There's nothing controversial about having an accurate nutrition facts panel on a product. Like, we don't compete on that. Where we do compete is when it comes to, you know, better for you type claims. And yet government is saying we want to get out of that. Well, to me, it's almost the inverse. I think government, frankly, could back off a lot of the prescription when it comes to, say, nutrition labeling and focus their role on enforcing a level, clear, science-based, you know, playing field when it comes to other aspects of labeling. So it's tough. I guess the only last thing I would add is I feel we've become very focused on sort of that real estate of labels on products when we all know most people are getting their information now from multiple sources. In fact, the label itself is perhaps the least important, right? And I don't think we've caught up to that reality that what's on social media or the ability to scan a product, a barcode or a QR code and get the information, like that's the future. And so we should be thinking about how we as industry are going to exploit those technologies to ensure we've got good, accurate, not misleading information through other sources.
In the back.
I got goodies. Right.
You also mentioned how 63 other plants closed in Ontario, not having gotten jobs. Would it be fair to assume that they're trying to consolidate their assets that they believe has become a more efficient?
Yeah, I wish that were the case, but in fact, in the vast majority of those examples, no, it's most cases, it's a US multinational that operated a branch plant in Ontario that is now closed, and the production is, you know, a couple of hours on a run in a plant in Wisconsin. and it's coming north. Like, there's very few examples of that sort of consolidation or scaling or reinvestment in assets in Ontario. Again, I only know the Ontario story. I believe it's quite similar in Quebec, but that tends to be the situation. It's not all bleak. Like in Ontario, for example, in the last couple of years, we've had an important new frozen pizza manufacturing operation invest in London, Ontario, Dr. Edgar Pizza. We've had some confectionery manufacturers making investments. In fact, that's partly due to the more favorable sugar pricing in Canada. So there are a couple of bright stories, but later this year, the Christie Foods plant in Toronto, which has been on the Toronto Lakeshore for, I don't know, 100 years, is about to close. And 550 jobs, all that production going south of the border.
Eva.
Yeah.
And when it comes to GMO labeling, also U.S. is more unsafe. I see food safety really is a global issue.
Yeah.
And U.S. withdrew the objection to GMO labeling in Kodak, and Canada hasn't. The U.S. is talking about how long it takes federal government to come up with the regulation. The U.S. the states they start having their own labeling on the GMO. Can Canada also do the same by having provincial labeling?
Provincial? Yeah. Well, of course, we have voluntary GM labeling in Canada. But the issue, you raise an interesting question. Actually, the event I was at here a week ago was the State Agriculture Rural Leaders Conference. I was amazed at how many petitions or processes are underway at the state level in the United States relative to voluntary or to mandatory GM labeling, or even other, animal welfare type measures. Of course, those are all very controversial because they interfere with interstate commerce, and likely legal challenges will prevent that from happening. And I think the same would be true in Canada because, the Constitution gives powers of interstate commerce to the federal government, and provinces can't interfere. So, I mean, it's a big topic, that whole issue of GM labeling. I have to say, personally, I believe a voluntary approach is the best, and in fact, there's some good science or economics around the reality that that's a more efficient way to ensure consumers obtain the right to know should the market, force them or make that happen.
Yes.
Roy, would you be able to share an opinion on
Food irradiation. Well, in fact, you may know the beef industry, the cattlemen, with support of the packers, have gone forward to relaunch the petition for approval of beef irradiation in Canada. So that's now back in play. I personally think it's a wise step. There's a whole question in food safety. You don't want to create an environment that there's some sort of silver bullet idea, or that because we're now going to irradiate or apply other interventions at the manufacturing level, that we can become less vigilant in the supply chain in terms of HACCP and sanitation, all the controls to that point. But having said that, frankly, I look at our aging population and I ask myself, if I were a senior today and I'm immunocompromised, I've got a health concern, and I want to choose foods that I know are very safe. Today, I don't have the choice to buy irradiated ground beef. And I think that's a consumer disservice. In fact, the Consumers Association of Canada have agreed now. They believe they do support it. The question becomes then, though, how do you educate people? Like, again, right now, you'd have to have the mandatory Radura symbol on the product, which, of course, I would argue has got a negative connotation, and the chances are you're going to steer people away from a healthier option, or rather a safer option, by doing that. So you have to get the labeling right. So that's the challenge, but in the end, I believe it's appropriate to approve more uses where it's scientifically justified, and then let the marketplace decide whether people are prepared to purchase that, and whether there's a growth opportunity, in fact. So, I think the market can sort that out.
Well, thank you very much, Rory.
Thank
Please,
you.